Thanks for attending the talk. As James mentioned, I'm part of Stanford University, but I'm also parallelly appointed by Deutsche Telekom Research Labs, so they're the ones who give me the bacon. And so, as part of Deutsche Telekom Research Lab, I'm a member of T Labs. So they have this theme of T Labs, T Mobile, T Home, and stuff like that. So the general concept is that we want to be looking at future internet design and see what dramatic disruptive technologies can actually make improvements to the core and be able to offer new services in the future. And once they spotted OpenFlow being developed at Stanford, they figured it's a good idea to see if it might be applicable and want to borrow the technology into the core of the network. So before I start talking about OpenFlow and give an introduction to it, I just want to get a general idea of who already knows about OpenFlow. Okay, so I'm happy that there are a few who actually haven't heard, and I'd be happy to introduce it. So the whole concept started with generally folks wondering, okay, how do you design the internet, and where are we right now? What stage of the internet are we right now? And how do we progress forward? So in general, the internet has been created based on the end-to-end principle. This is a purely engineering decision which was taken more than 25 years back, actually maybe 30 years back, which is basically a simple rule which says that anything which any function which is going to be useful for many applications, you put it in the core of the network, which are managed by the routers and the other middle boxes. And anything which are useful only for a few applications, you put them at the end so that you don't trouble the core with too much complexity. So the basic premise is that the network layer will be very simple. Unfortunately, folks took that too seriously and kept it simple for way too long. So even though we are doing security, we are doing mobility, we've been doing a lot of new things like peer-to-peer networking, the network has not changed dramatically. We've pretty much been having the same forwarding aspect, and we've not made a dramatic change to the network. So, for instance, my company, I mean, I still don't see so much of an incentive why they would want to progress their network if they have a constant revenue stream coming in. I mean, everyone's going to pay their monthly bills. You're not really saying, hey, okay, it's my cell phone, okay, you're dropping so many percentage of my calls. Maybe you should improve that next month. I mean, nobody's really complaining about that. So nobody ever changes the core as much. So we want to have a new technology which would somehow make the network evolvable so that it's not too expensive for the operators to change it, while also being more powerful for introducing new features. So I did a really informal survey of the list of features which went into the Cisco core switch, core router. And I don't really see too many new changes which have come in the past few years. And the big reason being that it's just too hard to introduce new services, and even if you do that, nobody's going to buy it to deploy it through the whole internet. So there's a deployability concern, and also that Cisco has a hold on the market and they don't want to introduce new stuff which are disruptive. So the main observations I made, again, it's an informal survey, so I'm trying to underplay it. So the routers are faster and more reliable, so very few crashes, but the features are beginning to ossify. You have very few set of features and it's hard to introduce new ones. And there's a deployability concern pretty much all through. And there's a chicken and egg issue where my company would tell Cisco, if you put in this feature, then we can offer this new service. And then Cisco would say, hey, you should start offering the service, we'll put in the feature. So there's a chicken and egg because nobody wants to put in the first money yet. Eventually it works down to that. And I mean, any guesses what traffic engineering typically most ISPs do these days? I guess most of you, if you're in networking, you would have heard about all these TEXCP, which is more dynamic traffic engineering, or even the conventional MPLS-based traffic engineering, which does a linear program to compute things. I mean, there are several different traffic engineering approaches which have been proposed in the past, but do you know what typically most people do? Sorry?
The guess.
Actually, yeah, the guess is a good guess, but sorry? No, they often just say, okay, if my network crosses 60%, I'll add a new link. I mean, that's pretty much it, and it's very manual. And unfortunately, that kind of thing won't work in the long run. So we need to have the network more programmable and dynamic. And hopefully we'll get to that soon. And also some things like secure BGP were never introduced because unless the whole network supports secure BGP, just one operator supporting secure BGP is absolutely of no use. So this is a all or nothing implementation problem. So all these are kind of telling why the network is ossifying, and so we need some new ways to offer new services. So about 10 years back, there were these folks who started looking at overlay networking to see how you can solve this. So what they said was that, hey, you have the whole network, you don't need to change the whole network, just pick out a few nodes and then have those few nodes form a separate virtual network, and then we'll do all my operations within the virtual network. So now I don't have the deployability concern as much because I only have to change few of the nodes and they can just work within each other to support the new service. And this is typically what an overlay network tries to do. And they have actually in the past proposed many different services based on overlays. For instance, even the peer-to-peer networking is in a way an overlay network. So the folks have proposed quality of service using overlays, folks have proposed better reliability using overlays, and even some voice over IP applications using overlays. So you can keep on doing, but the thing is, it just slowly starts adding complexity when every application starts doing their own thing. And if let's say at some point you see that all the applications are using a specific feature, then according to the end-to-end principle, you should actually really put it in the network because that's when you get the best cost versus benefit ratio. So this is where we started headed towards, and this is what creates this new concept of virtualization. So we create a virtual network, and then folks realized, okay, maybe there is benefit out of virtualizing the whole network. So I have a couple of examples of how overlay work. I'm just going to quickly run through them. So typically, you would want a multicast working like this. You have the core network trying to do traffic splitting. But if in case you don't have the support in the core node, then you would do it as a end system overlay, where you would try to send traffic from A to B, and then ask B to send more to C and so forth. This is how overlay networks work. If let's say you were able to actually make some small changes to the network, you don't have to make the whole network support multicast. You just probably have to put it in some critical points. So I just have to make a small change in one of the switches, and that would introduce a new packet replication functionality or something. And once I do that, you can see that I'm now not having to send 2 copies on this link, but just 1 copy. Or maybe if I make another change, then I don't even have to go to the end system B, but I just have to make another copy at this point. So you can see that I don't have to change my whole network, but change only at a critical point, and just put in these primitives at certain points, and you would be able to get almost same as what multicast would normally do. So this is just an example of what kind of little change to the network I'm talking about. And so this is what we started thinking, and in Stanford, Nick McKeown's group started looking into how you can put in a small primitive in the network, which can be globally useful. And they came up with this idea of OpenFlow and a small programmability element in the network. If I'm going too fast or you have any questions, feel free to stop me. I want to keep this as interactive as possible. So typically in the corporate world, I mean, that kind of a virtualization where each you create different virtual networks and have each virtual network do their own functionality is achieved in different ways. And the main reasons are that you want to improve the utilization of the network, because if let's say one virtual network has a low demand at a certain point while the other one has a high demand, then you can just have them on the same infrastructure and statistically multiplex. So that way you will improve the utilization. And second reason people use virtualization is because they would use this for debugging purpose. So you would create almost a replica of the existing network, but within a virtual environment, and you would use that for debugging purpose. And this is similar to what I guess you do in the PC world. In the PC world, you would actually create a virtual network, and if something happens, you're fine to let that crash. And also, one thing I noticed in my company is that so Deutsche Telekom was initially owned by the government, by the German government. So they pretty much owned all the fiber and all the cable and everything there is. And at some point in 1996, they diversified and said, okay, we're going to make this a private company. But once you make it private, you cannot become a monopoly and say that this fiber is still mine. So you need to now start sharing the fiber with all other smaller companies. So it so happened that even though the fiber was put down by Deutsche Telekom, they now have to start sharing it with other smaller companies. But they don't want any impact from them on their network. So the way they do that is they start virtualizing the links. So virtualization also helps with kind of doing this kind of a fair split of resources among different companies. And typically, at layer 2, you use virtual LANs for doing that, or if you go higher up into the core, you would use MPLS-based VPNs for doing that. So these are what most people use in the corporate world. So we want to see how we can make one framework which is more generic and which can even support both of these. So the whole umbrella project which I'm in and which pretty much most people are looking at these days is called Clean Slate Design, where you want to overcome the internet ossification through virtualization and programmability. And some other people are saying that you probably can never make the network support all the features, so you will still be doing virtualization in the network. So this is kind of the difference between something called the purist view and the pluralist view. Those are just details. I don't want to really go to that. Let me jump through this. So this is what kind of has been the trend over time of what all new features we've added to the network. So right now we are at a stage where we are trying to add more new services because the network is very capable, fast, very stable, and stuff like that. And we need to start having a clean slate and thinking so that we don't get stuck in the same issues in the past. But of course, you can never say I'm going to throw away all my hardware and start from scratch. So we need a solution which is clean slate in thinking, but it's evolutionary in the hardware. And two of the main things which are going to be part of that solution are going to be virtualization and programmability. So this kind of is the motivation of all the work and what we are trying to achieve. So specifically, OpenFlow was created to address this one particular problem of innovation. In general, there's a huge vendor monopoly in the world where people like Cisco or Juniper have a large control. And whenever an idea comes in, I mean, a researcher who's very altruistic comes up with an idea, and then you would implement that in the network. But once you implement it, most folks want to standardize it, so you wait many years. And then after standardizing, you deploy it, and then you realize it has problems, you start patching it up. So this is pretty much how the life cycle has been all through. And we want to now break this and make it so that anyone can program, and you even create a marketplace for different services so that anybody can make changes to the network and make it evolve. So I'm sorry to throw this slide at you. This is one of my corporate slides. So as you can see, the formatting is also very different. So this is what we use to make the business case to the company, saying, hey, you guys need to do OpenFlow. And yeah, this is where I put on my salesman hat and say, yes, you need to do this because you'll be able to save on the operational expense, because that is one of the big expenditure for most of the companies. For instance, my company, the capital expense is about 20%, but the operational expense is pretty much 80%, which is a large number, and it consists of both the management, which where you pay all the staff for managing equipment, and also you pay for the power. So Deutsche Telekom, okay, informally, I don't know who's recording, but yeah, off the record, Deutsche Telekom is supposedly the second largest energy consumer in all of Germany. I mean, second after the Deutsche Bahn, which runs the railway network. I mean, you wouldn't think a telecom operator would be the second largest energy consumer, but unfortunately they are. So, I mean, there are all these problems, and most of that is to do with the infrastructure. People just keep adding equipment and don't think about what it's going to cost. So, we want to slowly get around that and start making things very programmable and easy to adjust.
I have a question. So, if you have a programmable platform, isn't having a staff to manage it will cost more than platforms which are ossified? Of course, an ossified standard does not allow innovation, but at least it makes management easy.
Right. So you could have it programmable and still make it manageable, right?
So that it's still manageable, but the cost, the human cost of having trained people who would actually manage a programmable substrate, isn't that higher? So isn't the op cost going to go up if you have programmable routers?
It would not, because the big keyword here is open source. There are most of the people who are trying to support this. I mean, if let's say there's a problem in an OpenFlow network, I would actually start writing to a forum, and there would be someone else from, say, Princeton, who's kind of run into that, who would address that problem, and would actually even be willing to code code up some solutions to fix it. So open source would actually reduce infrastructure cost quite a bit. But you're right that there is a new technology they have to learn, and there's a little bit of a learning curve, which would cost money. And same goes for changing any equipment at critical points. But once you do that, it should become stable.
I mean, I don't know that that's necessarily a point, only because, like, for instance, you can buy a Cisco with the standard iOS and all that other stuff, and for an extra $5,000, you can get the pretty interface, or you could run Snack. And in some cases, I think you'll actually end up lowering costs because there'll be an open source implementation with an interface that'll be a lot nicer than sitting there with iOS.
But the production, if the system goes down, you can't wait for an OpenFlow developer or
That's right.
OpenFlow organization, OpenFlow support group to help you.
Too, well, you treat that the same way Canonical does. They have a service, and if you're in a production environment where it's system critical, you pay for a service.
So you become Red Hat then.
Red Hat, yeah.
So you follow the principles of somewhere along the line of Red Hat,
Essentially, yeah.
essentially.
So that's what companies like, I guess, the supporters of OpenFlow who are building the products are hoping, like NEC and people like that who build the hardware. They're also offering a support service which is not as expensive as what it used to be when it was a black box.
Yeah, you can make the same TCO argument from Red Hat versus Microsoft and the whole infrastructure.
We don't talk about Microsoft.
But
That's
the
the
same story.
So the moving on. Besides the programmability and the closed vendor monopoly and all those, the second problem is the lack of ways to innovate. You don't really have. If let's say I come up with a cool new feature or a service, I don't have a way to test it really, because I can do a simulation, but most people will come and say, you just did a simulation. Who's going to buy that? And okay, I can say I'll do a lab deployment using a few switches. Again, folks would say that's isolated and it's not going to be representative. What workload did you send? And I mean, they would just keep sending back and forth. You would have a bunch of papers you write, you get rejected and stuff like that. It's just kind of pointless. So most folks now figured you need a real platform where you can try out these stuff at scale and have realistic traffic go through that. So that's one of the other goals of this OpenFlow project. Anybody recognize this? I guess most people would. Yeah, this is the first internet. So this was just a small tunnel internet which is created 1980 maybe, or okay, if no one's complaining, I'll say 1980. But so this was the first internet, and it was really an experiment. But it just grew bigger and bigger, and folks started using it, and never really paused to think, okay, does it really live up to the production quality and all that stuff? So even though the internet started as an experiment, now we are starting to expect a lot more things out of it, and you're saying, okay, now it has to be carrier grade, you have to be production grade, and you have lots of these keywords and adjectives which are come on, and it's just hard to live up to that. So what we want to do is kind of go back to this lifestyle and say that, okay, we want to create a realistic testbed. So let's just make my production network as the testbed. So we try to kind of walk back in time and make the actual internet back into a testbed, which is what it was really started as. So we want to now create an infrastructure on top of your production network, and that's where the virtualization comes in. So you create a small virtual slice, and you do your innovation within that. And that's one of the goals of OpenFlow. So the two big goals are programmability and virtualization, so that you can pretty much do whatever innovation and also be able to test it at a global scale. So now I'll go on to introduce OpenFlow and how exactly it works. It's actually a fairly simple change to the network. So in the past, you used to have a switch in which you have a software layer and a hardware layer. The hardware has probably TCAMs or other switching stuff, which ensures that all the traffic is routed or forwarded at line rate. And also you would have the software which takes all the control decisions in the past. So if let's say a traffic with IP address X comes in, then the switch has to know somehow that, okay, to reach this IP address X, I have to go to port number Y. And to do that, you use the software there, and that's called the slow path. So the fast path is what you have in hardware, so that everything goes in line rate. And the slow path is what makes all the decisions, and that's done in software. And this worked very nicely, just that when the software is different in each of the equipment, it becomes a black box and you cannot change the software. And the only person who can change the software is actually the person who made the whole switch. So we want to kind of break this. So what we did there is we actually pulled out the software and put it on a remote machine which we call as a controller. So all the intelligence goes in this controller here, and all controller is the one which is in charge of making all the decisions for your whole network. And once the decision is made that okay, yeah, this traffic has to go to port number Y, it communicates that decision back to the switch using the OpenFlow protocol, and the switch would insert that action into the flow table. So what happens is that when the packet comes in the switch will tell the controller, hey, I got a packet with destination IP address X, what do I do? And the controller is going to send back a action to the hardware saying, okay, henceforth you're going to now send all the traffic with port number with IP address X out of port number Y. So that's a simple thing it does. So this is all the protocol there. So the OpenFlow protocol is nothing but a bunch of actions based on fields, packet header fields, and that's what is exchanged between these two. So you have no more heavy software component on the switch. The switch has become really, really dumb. And clearly you can see why the vendors would not want this, because now the dependence on the vendor is reducing and you've made them into a simple hardware manufacturer. And the money in hardware is much lower than providing a whole integrated solution. So now all my programming is in the controller, and I can actually write simple programs to implement my controller. And right now we have this software called Nox. So I'll give you an example shortly. And that just runs in a user space and it makes all this hardware flow table actions.
Does it keep cache at the hardware level or anything like that?
It does.
It does.
Yeah. So only the first packet is sent to the controller. The future packets are always sent using the cache entry. So we've pretty much decoupled the routing and the forwarding aspects. So the routing is now done in the controller, while the actual packet forwarding is done in the hardware. Okay. Again, different formatting, corporate slides. So all that we do is essentially change the switch. You have the software and the hardware. Change the software to have an OpenFlow component, and then write a controller, and have the controller speak this OpenFlow protocol with this software component. And this software component will push in all the flow table entries. So you don't really need this control path as much. You only need this control to speak with the controller.
OpenFlow allow to differentiate the traffic.
In what way?
For example, you can like access video, like packet level, or this comes from this ISP traffic.
So you can do this to some extent, as in you can do based on the on-time header fields. So okay, quickly I'm just jumping to this for a second. So you can do based on all these header fields, but not on the application stuff. So I cannot look deeper into the packet to figure out, okay, yeah, this belongs to this VLC application. I mean that's kind of hard.
No stand switching.
Sorry.
No stand switching. No data switching. You know, like in a storage array, you have
Yeah.
nothing like that. Right?
I'm not very familiar with that, but sounds like no.
But
These are the-
you have the ability to pick based on TCP ports. So, for instance, you know, like application port stuff like BitTorrent, you can split BitTorrent traffic off to one direction and keep HTTP traffic going in a completely separate direction. And we've actually done that already. So.
But who does the scheduling? Like, there are different applications or different flows.
Mhm.
Who does the scheduling? Like I might want to prefer, like he said, video or BitTorrent.
You want to give a priority?
Priority, yeah.
Okay, so you can actually give me a second. I'll come back to that. Let me just do this example. So just like how I mentioned, now all the programming and all this intelligence is now in the remote controller. So if let's say I want to do some special processing, I would upload it into the controller. So when the packet comes in, the switch is going to send a message to the controller saying, hey, I got this packet, what do I do? And the switch is going to send back action to all the switches in the network, because you don't really now, because you have a centralized controller, you can actually control all the switches and you don't have to do one at a time. So I would put in the rule on all the switches, and this packet is forwarded, And then all the subsequent packets are also sent according to the rule. So it doesn't go back to the controller anymore. So whenever a new flow comes in, you have a small setup time where it has to talk to the controller. But once that's done, you don't really have to depend on the controller anymore, and everything goes at line rate. And this is how we can keep up with the throughput and all that is needed from the current internet. So, okay, now jumping on. So this is exactly what the flow table action is sent once a new flow comes in. So it says that, okay, anything which matches a specific IP protocol number and a specific, say, TCP source port, I want to send it out of port number X. Maybe I can even say encapsulated using this VLAN tag or something. So you can do all these actions right now, and for each of the individual entries, there's also a packet and a byte counter which is maintained in the switch. So this is exactly what is stored in the flow table. So you have the rule to match and the exact action to take, and also the statistics for that rule. And in here, like he said, you can match based on the TCP port number. And as I mentioned earlier, the whole packet is sent to the controller. So it is possible that you can look into the payload of the packet to figure out what it might be, but eventually the switching is going to happen only based on these fields. And one of the actions which is not listed yet, unfortunately it's slightly older slide. Action number 5 is map this particular flow to a particular queue in the switch. So that's how I have the priority. So I can say that, okay, any flow which has TCP port number 80, which is my HTTP traffic, I would map it to queue number 1. While anything which is BitTorrent, I want to give it low priority, so I can map it to queue number 2. And then in the switch, often, I mean, NEC switch I think has 8 queues. So you can map it and you can set your priorities on that. Any questions? Yeah.
So the way you describe the connection setup, it seems like there's no real latency being added. Is that true?
No, there's a flow setup time, but there's no latency in the actual handling of the packet.
Let's say you're using some real-time protocol. You don't observe, since it's only a connection setup time, the initial setup, there's no observed latency difference.
None after that.
Okay, second question is, could you just go back to that slide? Yeah. So here, is the first node forwarding only after getting an acknowledgement from the controller that all the tables have been, all the rules have been updated?
Actually, that's a good question. No, we had a race condition based on that a while back.
Right.
His question is that here, the packet comes here. The switch is now buffering this packet, and it talks to the controller to find out, hey, what do I do with this and stuff like that. The controller sends a decision to all the individual switches, and once it sends that, logical sequence is that the switch, the controller also tells the switch, okay, that buffered packet you had, okay, go ahead and send it. But unfortunately, it doesn't wait for all the flow table entries to be made before sending it. So it could happen that you would drop a packet, but there was a race condition in the HP switch which we resolved. But this should not happen. And also there are acknowledgements for these individual rules. So you could program your controller to make it wait for that. So you can wait for the switch. I'm sorry, the controller can wait for the switch to first push the flow table entry before you start forwarding. Just that our implementation doesn't do that.
And so once you start doing that, that adds on to your connection setup time.
Yeah, but the thing is, you would have already had it anyways, right? Because you have to go through the network. In actual switch, I mean, if let's say you are doing an individual switch operation, I'm not doing a centralized option, but a distributed routing, then each switch is going to do its own software processing, right? So it's pretty much a similar kind of a delay. You add on individual delays. But yeah, that's possible.
In actual performance, you can typically get the flow setup to happen well before any of the standard protocols time out.
Yeah.
And so most of the time you won't even really notice.
Actually, any cases why, I mean, so far, so I run the network at Stanford. So we have all our users traffic actually go on top of OpenFlow, and no one so far has really complained to me about the flow setup time. Any cases why? I mean, no one has come to me saying, hey, 10 millisecond is typically what it takes. 10 millisecond is really bad. My connection is suffering and you should fix it now. I need it faster. No one's complaining.
Where are these routers and networks that you're running? Are they all over the
Yeah,
world?
they're all actually on the same floor. Actually, two of them are on the same floor, one of them is in the basement. I'll show you a topology later, but they're all fairly close by. The ping from one to the other is within a millisecond, let's say. No one has come knocking on my door saying, dude, you got to fix this.
So, and this is with the race condition as well?
Yeah, the race condition as well. Guess what's the predominant traffic which is being sent on the network? It's TCP, right? So pretty much 90% of our traffic is TCP, and TCP always has the handshake where you send a SYN and you don't send any more packets after the SYN, and you wait for the handshake, and often the traffic is not really within your network, it goes out somewhere. So this component is much smaller compared to the whole handshake process, which takes many milliseconds, which most folks have actually been used to so far. No one has complained in the past about TCP handshake time. So this kind of folds into that TCP handshake time, so no one ever is bothered about this little setup time which OpenFlow brings in. That's because of the design of TCP, and OpenFlow architecture actually fits very nicely with TCP.
Are you going to have some slides later on the performance of the PC as far as code, like rule handling? Just how many, like for example, connection setup per second or something?
So I don't have on these slides, but I can give you some informal numbers. Okay. So, for instance, the controller can handle close to about, we profile using a software. The controller can handle about 8 software, so 40,000 flows per second.
How many?
40,000.
Oh, okay.
The controller by itself, if I keep sending in any number of flows, software it's fast. The software switch can handle close to about, I think, 10,000 flow entries per second. But hardware is not that fast because you have to push the entry into the TCAM, which takes time. So the NEC switch can do about 330 flows per second, new flows. While the HP switch can do much lesser. Right now it's at, I think, somewhere close to 75 flows per second, which is really low. So they're still working on trying to improve it.
Okay.
The thing is, this is how it does in hardware. Sorry.
That just seems 75 seems really low.
Oh, it's really low.
You know what the reasons why
So,
it would be so slow?
in the past they always had aggregated entries, right? They only had destination MAC address based routing, and you don't have that many destination MAC addresses in your whole network, which come each second. So they never ran into this problem, but now you have this with OpenFlow, so they're trying to see how they can optimize it.
Okay.
And eventually, at some point, they may say, okay, this is the limit, and anything beyond this you have to aggregate. So we would have to start inserting aggregated rules. So here, I would have to start saying that, okay, anything with destination MAC address of X, I would always do this action and have an aggregated rule. And then I would have a higher priority rule if at all there's some flow which I want special attention to. And the number of flow table entries you can insert for aggregated rules, which we also call as wildcarded rules, are about 300. So you can only insert 300 wildcard rules. And the special processing rules, you can have about 2,000 of them. So at this point it's limited, but you can add external TCAMs and you can expand it, which is what we're hoping, and that's what we're hoping will solve the core issues. Any questions so far? So yeah, we can map also to a queue and have priorities and stuff. So this kind of introduces how OpenFlow works, and as you can see, the switch itself has no big programmability element. It's a very simple primitive. It just makes the switch dumb enough to process everything in hardware. You send a flow table action from the controller, and all my programming is done in the controller. And here's an example of exactly how much code it takes to actually build a Mac learning switch. I'm actually not going to go over any of this, but I just wanted to show that, hey, it's actually really cool. It's only a few lines to build a real switch, which if you actually look at a vendor's iOS code or something, it's multi-million lines of code. The reason it's simple is that in general, you're only pushing flow table entries after making decision in a centralized controller. And in a centralized environment, it's a lot easier to program. And you can either program in Python or C. And this specific code can be plugged into something called Nox, which is what we use as a controller. And it's built by this company called Nicira. So here, you can just put your callback even. So when a packet in comes in, I would learn the MAC address. And if in case I would learn the source MAC address. And once I learn the source MAC address, and now I would figure out what the destination MAC address and send it according to that. So this is all the real code there is. It's actually very few lines of code. It's easy to program, and I believe there are some folks here who also started looking at that. So if this was something of interest to you, you should talk to them. In general, using this, you can make your network very programmable. And sorry, go ahead.
Sorry, I do have a quick question. Last time I checked, they said that it was much more easier to develop in Python
Yeah.
as opposed to SQL. So is that still true?
I mean, actually, it's based on your comfort level. I mean, not specifically, there's no particular thing which says that, okay, we make it easier for Python. It's just that with Python, I mean, no, you don't have to worry about pointers and stuff like that. So it's just the programmer's convenience.
Okay, because I'm looking at the Python code for L2 switch, and I've been looking at the C one because I'm looking familiar with the C++, and the C++ is a lot more complicated.
Oh, I see.
Or more
The thing is, the Python one hides all that by, they have this thing called Swing. So whatever you do in Python uses the libraries of C which are exported through Swing. So there is some complex code written elsewhere, it's just the complexity is moved to a different part. So, but in general, it's an event-based programming model. So I found it fairly easy. Once you write your first application, everything after that is a lot easier. It's fairly intuitive. Can anyone tell me the difference between a switch and a router? Actually, even after my PhD, I had no clue what the difference was. So, if you get it wrong, it's fine. But any guesses? Okay. What's the difference with the forwarding? So, are you? I mean, that's a good point. So, you could say that. Switch uses the layer 2 information and forwards based on that, and switch uses layer 3. But you could also have a layer 3 switch.
Yeah, if you're switching, then you're not changing the IP address because you are not being, so the packet is not addressed to the switch. But if it's routing, then it's addressed to the router. Sorry, the MAC address. The MAC address will be the router's MAC address.
That's true. Actually, the big difference is that when you route, you're just routing based on only the destination IP address, and a router just uses the destination IP address to route, while switch could use anything, could use any other field. So if you actually want to build a router, you can actually use the same dumb hardware. All that you need to do is now just start paying attention to only the IP destination, and you don't. So I mean, it's actually, the difference is fairly simple and you can understand based on the headers, but nobody can understand based on the price. And the price of a router is actually multiple times that of a switch, and the difference all comes with exactly what all additional features they've added. And even though it's only just based on what headers you're using. So with OpenFlow, because you're able to now match on multiple different fields, you have about 10 different fields, you can actually build your router, you can build a switch. You can actually even build a firewall where I say that, okay, I'm only going to route based on my destination port. I'm going to block off everything else. Or you can even build something which uses a VLAN based switch. So all these can actually be built based on just these 10 field switching. So OpenFlow is a more generic platform which can be transformed into any other kind of a switch you want. And eventually we're also trying to push in MPLS tags, and that way you would also be able to make it an MPLS switch.
Those are only outbound, right?
Sorry? No, both ways. You have the source and the destination.
No, especially for the firewall, right? Say you want switching, it takes it in, you just drop the packet saying it's coming up for anything else besides 422, so drop it from your box.
Mm-hmm.
Do you do that?
Yeah, I can do that. I can drop whatever I don't want. I can push an action for. So you're saying drop based on what port I don't want?
Yeah.
Okay. Yeah. You can do that.
And that's a lot. See how much bandwidth or usage to add the CPU in the box. Do you know anything like that? Because then you're basically taking out all hostbase ideas and just doing it at the switch layer now in the box.
No, I didn't follow you. So why is Knox being occupied?
Because
So
you're dropping the packet, right? Because
but I'm not working on a packet level. So Knox, the controller, is not working on a packet level. It's working at a flow level.
Okay.
So it doesn't look at every packet. It only looks at the first packet. So once you push in the flow rules saying, okay, drop all these destinations, then it doesn't get any more traffic. And you can actually drop everything in hardware, so it's a lot convenient. So one thing which IDSs do is they also look into the actual payload and they do more complex stuff. So that, yeah, you can't do right now. But eventually you can think of, if let's say there are enough applications for that, you can think of OpenFlow being willing to support that as well. So that's how. So we have a meeting in Stanford every Tuesday where folks from Google and other companies come and say, hey, we need this feature in all the switches, and we all debate over it and see what to add in. So that's how slowly they started adding different features and fields to the spec. So if there is motivation for even doing application layer matching, certainly possible to add it in. Okay, the next part after the programmability is virtualization. So let's say you have the same infrastructure, but you wanted to have multiple different roles. You want one person making it, say, act as a route, just a simple routing network, while someone else wants to do some BitTorrent network, for instance, and they want to have some hardware accelerated functions. Maybe someone else is just a network administrator who wants to just keep viewing the network. So if you have multiple people wanting to do different things, the way you would go about doing, you can't, so if you have 3 different controllers you want to associate with the same network, you cannot do that, because you have, in general you have conflict resolution and all those things, which would start making the switch more complex. So again, we outsource this, and we create something called as a Flowvisor. And what the Flowvisor does is that it acts like a controller to all the switches, while it actually multiplexes this and it sends it, demultiplexes and sends it to the different controllers. So as far as the switch is concerned, the switches think that it's talking to one controller, but it actually demultiplexes and sends all the control traffic to individual controllers. And now I can actually program it further, and I can have different functions in each of the controllers. And the way you split is based on the flow table. And we would say that, okay, all my IP traffic, I would send it to, say, Alice's controller, while all my TCP port number 80 traffic, I would send it to Bob's controller. And I would send any traffic I have, just in read-only mode, I would send it to admin's controller. So admin cannot make any change to the network, but you can keep viewing the network. And you can do that both for topology and also for the traffic. So you can kind of demultiplex in this way, and this is what OpenFlow uses for virtualization. And with this, you can implement more controllers, have more people program the network, and have them all independently operating. And because, as I mentioned, we have queues right now, we can also isolate the traffic and ensure that no slice consumes more bandwidth than they really should be using.
Yeah, so one question, so what's the, so I'm still confused about the abstraction you're giving, like Alice's and Bob's controller, about what they can actually do in the flow table. Like, do they have control over just certain fields or ranges of fields, or what's the...
If let's say in the Flowvisor I put a policy saying Alice is going to get all my IP traffic,
Okay.
all the IP traffic,
Right.
and Bob's controller has a policy saying all TCP port number 80 traffic. Each of them will have control only on those flows which belong to that particular rule. But you can see there's a slight overlap between the rules. So in that case, the Flowvisor would have to take care of the overlap resolution.
Right, so
So-
how does the Nin
So right now there's-
resolve the conflict potentially?
So so right now there is none, because when you have 2 different experimenters who want to run, it's a little bit unclear exactly how to go about doing that. And at this point, the Flowvisor doesn't do that. But in the context of Genie, where you have multiple experimenters using the same network, we have to resolve it. So we've now started putting in some checks in place.
So it's still ongoing.
Yeah, still ongoing.
Sorry, can you quickly explain once again why is there an overlap, or why potentially?
Because Alice is looking at all the IP traffic, while Bob is looking at all the TCP port number 80 traffic. If it is TCP, it should be IP. So there's a overlap. So Alice could affect Bob's, but
So if you decide on a policy level that you only have mutually exclusive,
you could do that. We don't do that yet.
and what's the disadvantage of doing that? Is that because you don't have that level of?
No, it's just that not coded yet. It's all ongoing work.
Okay.
So right now I just actually statically coded in my policy saying I would give Alice all IP traffic except port number 80, and Bob I would give all the TCP port number 80. So
There can be some conflict between the policies. Right?
yeah, so right now we are resolving it manually, but eventually it has to be made automatic.
But our prototype experiment does exactly that. It gives all but port 10,000 to one controller, and then hands off port 10,000 to a different controller, and then lets each individual controller manually deal with their own traffic. And so there's potential for overlap, but there doesn't have to be overlap. You can force the rules to not overlap.
At what point do you do that?
In the FlowWizard policy.
In the FlowWizard.
Yeah.
Yeah.
So.
So is there a way of reserving bandwidth, like for an experimental, or is it like planet lunches question?
So at this point, I mean, this policy thing I mentioned is from the recent version onwards. The firmware just came out, so we don't yet have it in the substrate. But eventually, you can have again a policy in the FlowWizard where I can say that okay, this much bandwidth I allocate to this slice. So yeah, we don't yet have that, but that's ongoing. So we can kind of picture the flow space to be something like this, where it could be a multi-dimensional view and you don't have an overlap, but each of them have a chunk of the flow space and they have control on all the flows. And you can implement different functions and have them also see different topologies. And this is actually a demonstration we showed at SICOM last year. We had a couple of different experiments running on top of the same substrate in Stanford, and we used the FlowWizard to virtualize them. And yeah, incidentally, it also won the best demo award. Okay. So one top question which a trick question here is that how do you even handle the control connectivity? I mean, we are not dramatically trying to change the network, trying to make it programmable and all that. Remember that the first packet which comes to the switch is sent to the controller. It's sent. If all my connectivity is using OpenFlow, then how does it even know how to reach the controller, right? So there's a chicken and egg here. So you need to be able to have some non-OpenFlow connectivity because you need to be able to reach the controller for that. So we resolve that by having some non-OpenFlow traffic. But with the wireless nodes, we don't actually have that. We have just both the control channel and the data channel using the same link, and that's called in-band. And we have some way we do that using VLANs. And second question, I guess we talked about. So there are all these challenges which keep coming up, and one of the things which come up is, hey, what happens if we have a non-OpenFlow switch in between? I mean, clearly we're not going to be able to change the whole internet day after tomorrow or something. So there are going to be some non-OpenFlow switches, and when that happens, some things are going to break. You're going to see problems where the topology is going to be inconsistent because if let's say have a topology, is there a whiteboard? Okay, it's hard for you to see, but let's say you have 3 OpenFlow switches, but you have one non-OpenFlow switch in between. Let's say they're just connected through that. Now, as far as switch A is concerned, B and C are actually connected to the same link. So it's actually going to think it's a point-to-multipoint connection, and routing is going to break, and you're not going to have a consistent routing. So there are all these problems which we slowly have to start resolving, and ensure that when you code in Knox, you always look for these conditions and use cases. And also another problem which can happen is if you have 2 different islands which are connected by an non-OpenFlow network, then you're going to see packets coming with the same destination address in 2 different sites, and you're going to now the Knox is going to start getting confused exactly where this traffic belongs. So you got to resolve that. So it's almost like we're starting the network from scratch and running into a new set of problems, including say the race condition we ran into, and that took a while to figure out. And also we got to figure out how to scale this. Clearly, the flow table entries are not sufficient enough at this point to scale it to the whole internet. I can't say that okay, everyone can do whatever experiment they want. We still have some limits. And we're also trying to see where the controller can be running. So once you create a global testbed and you have an experiment creating a global slice, or rather, let's say you're at Rutgers and you want to create a whole network, and I want to run an experiment across the whole US. The latency from Rutgers to Stanford is about 100 milliseconds. And if you have a controller at Stanford, clearly it's going to be bad and your performance is going to suck. So you're going to figure out how to do that. And even firewall issues are something which we commonly run into.
So firewall issues, how is that control packet actually encapsulated?
For the firewall?
Well,
so right now we're just punching holes through it, but
well, I guess can you add an arbitrary encapsulation header on to the packet for the best for the
Uh,
or you have to send it like BGP? I mean, I'm just curious.
Yeah,
what the encapsulation for it is.
So because the traffic going to the controller is using the non-open flow network, we are assuming it's kind of already figured out. But yeah, I'm sure we'll run into that problem. One other thing is that you could potentially, in this kind of scenario, the switch is the one which makes the connection to the controller and not the other way around. So that also helps some cases where you have the switch behind the firewall, but the controller outside the firewall. And also, you can now start thinking of this as a new marketplace. I can start creating my own applications and maybe something to do what the iPhone is managing to do. So I could even have a controller which I run as a service on EC2, the Amazon EC2, and I can tell people who want a new service, I can tell them all that you have to do is just connect to this controller here, and your switch are going to do some cool new tricks. Well, you don't have to release the source code while you actually give access. So you can kind of think of those kind of innovations as well. Okay, so this I kind of informally mentioned. So operation expenses are large, and this is one of the big reasons why operators like OpenFlow, and they want to make a big change to the network. They want to make things more manageable. And one of the other things we're starting to look at is how can we conserve power and use OpenFlow for that. Sorry.
So I have a question. So, when the controller is making a decision, it needs to know the topology of the network, the physical topology.
We use LLDP. So we send LLDP packets. So the controller makes up a packet, sends it to the switch, and tells the switch to forward out of port number X. And based on where it's being received, it will know that okay, there's a link between those two. So it uses link layer discovery protocol, and it figures out the topology. So it's very dynamic. You don't have to configure anything.
And it's like going on continuously.
Yeah.
Periodically.
What is the time right now? You watch stop. Okay. I'll quickly go over this just a couple of minutes. So these are some of the applications I'm working on. So slightly biased view, but there are several other applications which people are demonstrating on top of OpenFlow. So one of the things I'm working on is trying to build a server load balancer. So you have n number of servers, and any web request which comes in, I want to send it to a different server. So that's the application I'm trying to work on. And typically you would do that by building a data center if you are Google. Then in that case, any request which comes in to the core switch, I would just send it to a different network. And because I have a structured network and it's all evenly balanced, any request comes in, if I send it to a random server, it's going to have a balance in the network. But you cannot do that if you have an unstructured network like a campus network. Because for one, you have a spanning tree topology. So you don't have any loops. And if let's say a request comes in through here, it's going to stuck in the spanning tree, and it's going to not be able to scale up to the bandwidth you can actually get in this. You cannot have one request go this way and the other request go the other way. That's going to be a problem. So we were thinking how to better support this and build a load balancer using OpenFlow. And because OpenFlow gives you control of the network and lets you control the routing, we went about creating a system called Plug and Serve. What it does is that we have a bunch of switches here. You can plug in any server you want to any of the switches, and the OpenFlow controller, which is common for all the individual networks, is going to sense that okay, there's a connectivity between these switches and servers are connected here. And any request which comes in, it's going to distribute it across all the individual servers connected. So this is a demonstration which we showed about 6 months back at Genie Engineering Conference. So we had a little island at Stanford, and this is an island at Internet 2, and here's an island at Princeton, and we had some server connected here and some servers connected at Stanford. So now we've expanded the island to also incorporate Washington University, so slightly bigger. So any request that comes in, we would actually send it to a different server based on which server is the most loaded, and also make it take a different route based on which link is also loaded. So you can pay attention to both the topology and also the individual link load and send it to the least loaded server. And OpenFlow lets you do that very easily because you have complete control on the network and you don't have to worry about spanning tree anymore. If you have any loop, then the network is going to know that beforehand, and it's going to ensure that you don't cause a broadcast storm. So this is one of the applications we showed, and a second application which we are looking at now is how to conserve power in a network. So as in the same example of the data center, you have a network which is often provisioned for the peak. So you would always have all the switches on and running and all the links up and running, because maybe on Monday evening at 8 o'clock there's going to be a peak load and you want to ensure that the network is available for that. So if you provision your network for peak load, you're always going to end up wasting resources. And we also did an experiment to see how much energy is consumed. So this was actually computed by HP Data Center. So in the HP Data Center, they sent different levels of traffic, but the amount of power consumed was fairly static because you're not really changing the network. And even though the load changes, it has no impact on how much power is consumed. This is really bad because there's no energy proportionality. You're going to end up using up all this energy even at the low period, and that's suboptimal. So we figured, we were looking at how we can make this better using OpenFlow. So we've started paying attention to what all links we can power off when there is no load in it. And also we can also start powering off switches when there's no load. So we started using OpenFlow for crunching all the incoming requests into fewer set of resources. So I'll try to allocate all my web requests using just the available switches and turn off all the switches and links I don't use. And clearly it takes more than a few seconds to turn up a link or a switch. So we use some kind of a forecasting model to figure out when a switch would be needed to turn it on before you really need it. So by just doing this, and also you can try to move your workload around, or you can try to vary your link speed. So by doing all these kind of things and using OpenFlow for routing the traffic accordingly, you can conserve a lot of power. And we just did an estimate in our topology. So we actually have a little network using HP and NEC switches. We have a little data center network, and in that we saw how much power is conserved. So when there is no load in the network, I'm using about 50% of the original network power. So we actually conserve close to 40% of the network power. But as and when the network slowly increases, I have to start turning on switches, and you can see that it's a stepwise thing. So exactly at about 30%, we figure that we need one more switch, so we turn that on, so the power increases. And at close to about 50% utilization, you see that you need some more switches, you turn that on. So we turn on switches and links based on exactly how much network load there is. And we managed to save some power, and this we call as elastic tree because it's a very flexible topology, and it manages it based on how much load is in the network. Next example is on monitoring. So we were just trying to see how we can improve monitoring. Let's say you have traffic going like this, and you have a special monitor connected to node B, which samples all the traffic going through. Maybe it's doing a T packet inspection or something. And let's say I want to monitor this this really small green flow. Then once I set the monitor up, instead of taking the monitor and going there, you can just reroute your traffic through the monitor and ensure that the traffic does not violate any capacity bounds. So I can just move the green traffic onto that node B, and I can just adjust the traffic according so that you don't have any bandwidth constraints. So I'm not violating traffic engineering while ensuring that I'm managing to monitor the anomalous flow. So you can use OpenFlow for traffic monitoring as well. So one other thing which we are now promoting is how to use OpenFlow for a virtual substrate, and how to use OpenFlow for building a global environment for network innovation. So this is a big project spanning all over US, and even Rutgers is part of that. And we collaborate with Rutgers on this project. So we're trying to create a large testbed so that you can run experiments and innovate easily. And we don't want to innovate just in the core of the network, but also in enterprise. For instance, even in the campus network, you can innovate and you can come up with new services. And we want to have production traffic and the research experiment to safely coexist so that each one doesn't affect the other. So we are working on creating this network right now. There are OpenFlow islands in all these places, including Rutgers, and they are all connected by Internet 2 and National Lambda Array. And hopefully by November we'll have a broad network, and we have PlantLab nodes in each of these places connected to these switches. So you can actually reserve both computing resource as well as network resource. So you can have a large-scale experiment running. And this is how our topology looks like. So all the users are kind of forcibly on the OpenFlow network. So we're kind of eating our own dog food, and no one is on a non-OpenFlow network. So all the users are connected to either an NEC switch or a HP switch, and all the traffic eventually goes to the basement and goes into the non-OpenFlow network. So here's where we are plugging into the Stanford network, and the NOx controller is actually in the remaining Stanford network. And on top of this, as you can see, we have three different networks. The blue one is the wireless network, which is using OpenFlow, so that's production, and all the actual user traffic goes on that. And the orange network is our wired network. Again, that's our production, and usually people are not happy if we disturb that, so that's always the most stable one. And the dotted one is our demo network, which is the most unstable. We keep tearing down and putting it back, and that's on a different VLAN. And that's what we use for all our SICOM demos. So last SICOM conference, we demonstrated about 5 different experiments, and all those are functional, and we keep showing them on top of that VLAN. And they're all coexisting, and there have been problems in the past where one of the demonstrations are pulled on the switch, but so now it's getting more stable, and we have a well-controlled network. And we're hoping all the campuses eventually get to this point, and we can eventually even connect this demo network from Stanford onto demo network of Rutgers onto the demo network of Washington and so forth, so that you can use that for experimentation.
So what's a user in this slide?
The users?
Yeah.
So that's the room number, sorry. G356. G356 is Gates building 356. There are about 3 users in that room. So the wireless users, there are about 20 of them, including the professors who manage the project, like Mika and Guru. But wired users, yeah, these are the ones. We're slowly expanding to other floors of the building. This is right now on the 3rd floor. And hopefully we'll have all the individual data planes connected at layer 2 or below, or maybe even physical layer, and all the control planes also connected. So we would have one flow visor on each of the campuses, and each of the flow visor would talk to one controller, which the experimenter is running. So we would still have the high latency problems. We would have to figure that out. So those are all some challenges we would have to resolve. So to summarize, yeah, actually, this is a really interesting blurb I found in one of the call for funding proposals which were out there. And I mean, I don't know if we would ever get to that point, but I just thought it just verbose and very interesting, so I always put it up as the last slide. So the future network would be something we would be able to innovate in. I don't know if we'd be able to do all these things, but many people want it to be many different things. But at some point, as long as you have some level of programmability, you can and make it open source, you'll be able to innovate and have more people contribute to it. And OpenFlow is a step in that direction. Somewhere in there, I used to have, yeah, you should also be able to fund pizzas or something. But yeah, I took that out. Folks started getting very serious about it. So yeah, this summarizes my talk. If you have any questions, I'd be happy to